Welcome back to another deep dive. Today we're giving you a backstage pass into the absolute machinery of American politics.
Oh, yeah, a real look under the hood.
Exactly. We are looking at how a major political party actually organizes its most powerful members. If you have ever watched the news and wondered what is truly happening behind the closed doors of the United States Senate, well, this is exactly where you want to be.
It is a phenomenal structure to examine. We're diving into a system that started out as a collection of completely unrecorded, highly secretive meetings and somehow evolved into this sprawling modern communications powerhouse.
Yeah, and to get to the bottom of this, we are unpacking a really comprehensive Wikipedia article. It details the history, the rules, and the operational structure of the United States Senate Republican Conference.
Right.
Our mission today is to decode how this formal organization was built, how it operates today, and really how it manages this incredibly delicate balance between collective party power and fierce individual independence.
It is quite the tightrope walk. But before we jump in, we don't need to set a quick ground rule for you, the listener.
Yes, very important.
Because of the nature of the topic, our source material today naturally contains politically charged terminology. You will hear references to the Republican Party's ideology using terms like conservatism, right-wing populism, and Trumpism.
Right, and it is crucial to state right up front that in this deep dive, we are absolutely not taking any political sides.
None at all.
We are not endorsing any of the viewpoints, policies, or ideologies that we will be discussing. Our mission here is strictly an impartial exploration of the factual history and the organizational structure.
We are just looking at the blueprints of the political machine.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this, starting with what this conference actually looks like today.
Well, at its most fundamental level, the Senate Republican Conference is the formal organization of all the Republican senators in the United States Senate. And effective January 2025, they hold the majority.
Meaning they had the numbers.
Right. That means the conference is made up of exactly 53 senators out of the 100 total seats in the chamber.
You know, calling it a conference almost feels like a misnomer to me. When I hear that word, I picture, I don't know, a group of people sitting around a long mahogany table hashing out a single bill.
Yeah, like a standard boardroom.
Right. But this is not just a meeting room.
Not even close. Over the last century, the mission of the conference has expanded so massively. It operates essentially as a full-service media and communications firm for its members now.
A media firm.
Yes. They provide high-end graphics, radio production facilities, dedicated television services, and extensive internet support. The primary goal today is to equip those 53 senators with a massive infrastructure so they can communicate their activities to the media and directly to the public.
So you really have to think of the modern conference as a massive corporate board combined with a dedicated in-house public relations agency.
That is the perfect way to look at it.
They are managing high-level legislative strategy, sure, but they're also managing a highly sophisticated, unified public image. And to run a machine with that much operational scope, you need a serious, multi-layered hierarchy.
Oh, absolutely.
Let's look at the 2025 leadership roster because it really illustrates how specialized this whole thing has become.
The chain of command is extensive. At the very top, you have John Thune from South Dakota serving as the Senate Majority Leader. He is the one steering the broader ship.
The big boss of the chamber.
Right. And just below him, managing the floor votes and keeping members aligned, is John Barrasso of Wyoming serving as the Majority Whip.
Okay, so those are the overarching chamber roles.
Yeah.
But then you have the leadership specifically dedicated to running the internal conference itself.
Yes, the internal CEO, basically.
Exactly. Tom Cotton from Arkansas is the chairman of the Republican Conference, with James Lankford from Oklahoma serving as his vice chairman.
And then the structure spiders out into very specific strategic committees. You have Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia chairing the Senate Republican Policy Committee. They handle the deep dive legislative research.
The policy wonks.
Exactly. Then Tim Scott of South Carolina chairs the National Republican Senatorial Committee. Now, that committee pivots entirely away from legislation to focus purely on campaign strategy and getting more Republicans elected.
And it doesn't even stop there. You have Chuck Grassley of Iowa holding the position of President pro tempore, essentially standing in as the chamber's presiding officer. It is an incredibly dense, highly structured organizational chart.
It really is. But, you know, looking at this massive modern PR and policy machine today, it is almost comical to think that for the first several decades of their existence, these guys refused to even leave a paper trail.
Wait, really? They just didn't write anything down.
It's nothing official.
How do you run a cohesive legislative body like that?
Well, you run it in the shadows. The modern conference is a direct descendant of the early American Party caucus. Back in the 19th century, these party meetings were entirely private.
Total secrecy.
Total secrecy. They would gather to decide party policies, approve executive appointees, select candidates. But they did it all with a strict code of secrecy to ensure absolute candor among the senators. Because of that, early records of these deliberations simply do not exist.
That is wild to imagine in today's era of constant live streaming and social media.
Right.
Just dozens of senators locked in a room deciding the fate of national policy, and nobody is taking notes.
Eventually, though, the sheer logistics of running the Senate forced their hand.
Yeah.
By 1874, they realized they couldn't just wing it anymore, so they created a steering committee strictly to prepare a legislative schedule for the members to consider.
Just to keep things on track.
Yeah, that was one of the earliest formal attempts to create a baseline of party unity.
And things slowly started to formalize from there. By 1897, the conference began to acquire real institutional weight under the chairmanship of Senator William B. Allison of Iowa.
He was a major figure in getting them organized.
But it still took until 1911 for Senate Republicans to actually begin taking formal minutes of their meetings. We're talking about decades of history just lost to the ether before someone finally picked up a pen.
It is crazy. And shortly after that, in 1913, they officially began referring to their organization as the Conference, deliberately moving away from the word caucus.
Rebranding, basically.
Yes, the organization was maturing, but even with minutes being taken, they still guarded their privacy fiercely.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because there is one massive historical anomaly that completely breaks that rule of secrecy.
Oh, this is my favorite part of the history.
On May 27, 1919, the conference held an open meeting. It remains the only open-party conference in the entire history of the United States Senate.
What's fascinating here is the underlying motive. You might assume they opened the doors out of some newly discovered democratic ideal of public transparency, but that wasn't it at all.
Not even close.
It was actually a highly calculated maneuver to settle a fierce internal power struggle.
Set the scene for us. What was causing this level of infighting?
The leadership was trying to reaffirm its strict commitment to the seniority system for choosing committee chairmen. Specifically, they were attempting to elect Senator Boyce Penrose of Pennsylvania as the chairman of the Finance Committee.
Okay.
However, a faction described as progressive Republican insurgents fiercely objected to Penrose's elevation.
So the leadership is facing a full-blown internal rebellion over committee power, and their solution is to invite the press and the public inside.
Exactly. By holding this singular open meeting, the leadership effectively forced these progressive insurgents to air their grievances in full view of the public and the media. It completely changed the dynamic of the argument. Instead of a backroom brawl, it was a public spectacle, and the leadership used that pressure to crush the rebellion.
They outplayed them.
They did. The insurgents lost the fight, Penrose got his chairmanship, and the seniority system was firmly cemented. It was a brilliant tactical weaponization of transparency.
The ultimate political power play. They opened the doors just long enough to embarrass the rebels and then presumably slam them shut again for another century.
Pretty much.
Once that dust settled, the conference continued to structurally evolve, particularly regarding how it handled leadership out on the actual Senate floor. Because in the 19th century, there really wasn't a formal floor leader like we picture today, right?
No, the concept of a singular floor leader didn't really exist yet. Legislative guidance mostly came from whoever happened to be the powerful committee chairman at the time.
Like decentralized.
Very. The chairman took responsibility for moving their specific measures on the floor. The conference chairman acted as a sort of informal leader, but it wasn't a dedicated official floor role.
That dynamic formally shifted on March 5, 1925. That is when the conference held its first recorded election for a formal floor leader. They unanimously chose Senator Charles Curtis of Kansas, who happened to already be the conference chairman.
Meaning he held both massive levers of power simultaneously?
Exactly. But the evolution of that power dynamic was anything but a straight line.
No, it wasn't. During the 1930s, the political landscape shifted so drastically during the Great Depression that the Republican Party held incredibly few seats in the Senate.
It was a massive drought. The numbers were so depleted that they were basically operating a skeleton crew.
They really were. In fact, they didn't even bother having a permanent whip during that era.
They just skipped it entirely.
Yeah. The conference chairman and floor leader at the time, Senator Charles L. McNary of Oregon, he just appointed temporary whips on a purely ad hoc basis for specific individual pieces of legislation.
That really underscores how adaptable this organization has to be. You go from the height of institutional power to barely having enough guys in the room to justify a permanent whip. That era of temporary fixes continued until McNary passed away in 1944, and his death ended up sparking a permanent structural change for the conference.
Yes. In 1945, the decision was made to permanently separate the roles of conference chairman and floor leader.
Splitting the job.
Exactly. Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan took over as the chairman, handling the internal organization, while Wallace H. White Jr. of Maine became the floor leader, managing the actual legislative combat out on the floor.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that 1945 separation remains one of the defining structural differences between the two major parties in the Senate today.
It really is.
The Senate Democratic Caucus still combines the roles of floor leader and conference chairman into a single, highly centralized position, whereas the Republicans deliberately keep those powers split between two different senators.
It is a fascinating divergence in operational DNA for two organizations that work in the exact same building. And for the Republicans, splitting those roles in the mid-40s really cleared the way for the modern administrative apparatus to truly take shape.
Because suddenly, you have a dedicated conference chairman who isn't bogged down by minute-to-minute floor strategy. They can focus entirely on building the institution.
Precisely. And the first major leap forward there happened in 1946. That early steering committee we mentioned earlier was formally transformed into the Republican Policy Committee.
Okay.
And, more importantly, it did so under legislation that appropriated equal government funds for both the majority and minority parties.
That is a staggering shift. They went from being an informal, private club meeting in secret to a federally funded, taxpayer-supported policy apparatus.
And with federal funding comes massive expansion. Up until the mid-70s, the staffs of the conference and the policy committee were actually housed together under a single staff director who managed their joint budgets.
Sounds crowded.
It was. As the scope of their work grew, the bureaucracy simply got too big.
So between 1979 and 1980, under the chairmanship of Senator Bob Packwood of Oregon, the staffs of the conference and the policy committee were finally separated.
Yes, a clean break.
The policy committee took the legislative research, which freed up the conference to heavily lean into its communications mission.
And that pivot was crucial. Under Chairman James McClure of Idaho in the 1980s, the conference began heavily investing in television and radio services.
The TV era.
Exactly. They recognized that the 24-hour news cycle was completely changing the nature of politics, and their members needed the infrastructure to compete in that environment.
And as the millennium approached, they had to adapt all over again. In 1997, Senator Connie Mack of Florida, serving as conference chairman, created the first digital information technology department. He brought the entire operation onto the web.
It is an incredible trajectory. You have guys in the 1870s tentatively forming a committee just to figure out a basic legislative schedule, and a century later, it is a fully integrated digital communications firm pushing a unified agenda online.
So what does this all mean? We have painted a picture of a massive, multi-million-dollar machine with TV studios, highly paid strategists, and a rigid leadership hierarchy. But how much actual power does this conference wield over its 53 members?
Technically speaking, absolutely none.
Which is the most counterintuitive part of this entire deep dive. You have this towering organizational chart, yet the most crucial operational rule of the Senate Republican Conference is that it is definitively not a caucus in the dictionary sense of the word.
Right. A traditional dictionary definition caucus is a partisan legislative group that uses its internal procedures to make decisions that are strictly binding on its members.
Meaning they have to follow the group.
Exactly. If a true caucus holds a private vote to support a bill, every single member is expected, and often structurally forced, to vote for that bill out on the floor, regardless of their personal stance.
But the Senate Republican Conference rejects that model entirely. The decisions made internally are strictly non-binding. Every single senator maintains absolute voting independence.
It is fiercely protected.
There is a fantastic anecdote from 1867, during the incredibly tense years of Reconstruction following the Civil War, that perfectly illustrates this culture of independence.
Oh, the Charles Sumner story.
Yes.
So, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts flat out refused to follow the conference's established policy on a particular issue.
Right.
Another senator, William P. Fessenden of Maine, was furious and publicly challenged him. Fessenden argued that Sumner had no right to vote on the subject during the internal conference meeting if he didn't intend to be bound by the decision of the majority.
And Sumner's response is the ultimate mic drop. He simply retorted, "I am a senator of the United States."
So good.
His point was that his primary duty was to his state and his constitutional office, not to the internal straw polls of his political party.
And the most telling part of that entire exchange is that the conference made absolutely zero attempt to discipline him. They couldn't. That level of individual autonomy was considered sacred.
But eventually, they realized that relying on unwritten cultural norms wasn't enough. They decided to put that independence in writing. On March 12, 1925, a resolution introduced by Senator Wesley L. Jones of Washington was passed in the conference without a single objection.
That 1925 resolution serves as the absolute bedrock of how the conference operates to this day. It was explicitly passed to make clear, beyond any question, the long-settled policy that their conferences are not caucuses and they have no binding effect upon those participating.
The exact wording of the resolution is a masterclass in political maneuvering. It states that the meetings are solely for the purpose of exchanging views to promote harmony and united action so far as possible.
So far as possible, it is the perfect legislative caveat.
Truly.
The resolution explicitly dictates that no senator attending the conference shall be deemed bound in any way by any action taken by the conference. They remain entirely free to act upon any matter exactly as their own judgment dictates.
And it goes even further to protect the individual. The resolution concludes by stating that it shall not even be necessary for any senator to give notice of their intention to take action different from what the conference recommends.
You don't even have to give a heads up.
You can just walk out onto the floor and vote against the party line without a word to the leadership.
Which is an absolute logistical nightmare for a floor whip whose entire job is to count votes and predict outcomes.
It has to be.
You have this beautifully organized hierarchy, a massive communications budget designed to project a unified front. And yet at the end of the day, all 53 senators are complete free agents who don't even owe you a warning before they go rogue.
It is the ultimate paradox. So they aren't using these formal conference meetings to whip votes and bind members to a unified strategy. Where is the actual coordination happening? How do they ever achieve that harmony the 1925 resolution talks about?
Well, because formal conference meetings are actually relatively rare these days. Since the late 1950s, the conference mostly just meets at the beginning of each new Congress to elect their leadership and approve committee assignments.
Okay, so when do they actually talk strategy?
The real day-to-day strategy happens elsewhere. Former Republican leader Everett M. Dirksen pulled back the curtain on this back in 1959.
Dirksen revealed that the weekly policy committee luncheons are where the real magic happens. He stated that when the policy committee meets weekly over the luncheon table, it is actually a de facto meeting of the entire Republican conference.
Exactly.
That is where all matters of pending business are discussed and where all the information possessed by the leadership is freely diffused to every member.
The real engine of the Senate Republican Conference isn't a grand boardroom or a formal parliamentary session with gavels and recorded votes. It is a weekly private lunch.
Just lunch.
That is where the actual debate happens, where the whip counts are quietly and informally calculated, and where the unified messaging that you eventually see on Sunday morning television is originally crafted.
It all comes together over lunch. It is amazing to think about the duality of this institution. We've covered some incredible ground today.
We really have.
We started by looking at the sheer, sprawling scale of the 2025 modern apparatus, the taxpayer-funded media studios, the specialized leadership roster, the digital outreach. We traced its evolution from a group of guys in the 19th century refusing to keep a paper trail to the dramatic anomaly of the 1919 open meeting used to publicly crush a rebellion.
And we examine how the burden of leadership forced the roles of conference chair and floor leader to permanently separate in the 1940s.
Yes.
And finally, we unpacked the core tension at the heart of the organization, a highly sophisticated, unified public relations machine that relies on a 1925 rule completely protecting the absolute voting independence of every single member.
So, why does all this matter to you, listening right now? It matters because this specific organizational architecture dictates the political reality you consume every single day.
It shapes everything you see on the news.
Exactly. When you watch the news and see a senator dramatically breaking party ranks on a crucial vote, or conversely, when you see a perfectly synchronized messaging campaign rolling out across every social media platform simultaneously, you aren't just watching random political weather. You're watching the direct results of this historical tension between the modern media machine and the unyielding independence guaranteed by the Wesley L. Jones resolution.
This raises an important question, one we want to leave you to ponder today.
Let's hear it.
Considering that the only open conference meeting in Senate history was way back in 1919 to settle an internal dispute, what would happen if the weekly policy committee luncheons were suddenly broadcast live to the public today?
Oh, that would be chaotic.
Would absolute transparency destroy the harmony and united action that the 1925 resolution aimed to protect? Or would it simply change the way modern senators negotiate with each other?
That is a phenomenal thought experiment to end on. What happens when the private lunch goes public? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden machinery of the Senate. Keep questioning the invisible structures behind your everyday headlines, and we will see you next time.